Hello, continuums of care around America. We're going to be starting officially in about 60 seconds, but we wanted to go ahead and log on to give you a minute to get all situated. We'll do formal introductions in just a minute. This is Don Gilman from beautiful sunny Jacksonville, and Tim McKinney from here in Orlando, Florida, and I'm Andre Bailey. I'm also from Florida. It's an all Florida continuum of care webinar on homelessness, and we're going to be starting again in about 60 seconds. Get settled. So on the West Coast, you got people in 10 o'clock. It's breakfast time. It's Starbucks. It's that first glass of Starbucks. On the East Coast, it's going to be this is the post-lunch webinar. So again, we're excited to be talking to you today about how continuums of care can kind of break through that glass ceiling and solve some of your biggest problems when you're trying to end homelessness, and how you can use collective impact. I don't love that term because I think it's overused, but people do understand what you mean by that when you say collective impact. How do you pull your community together and have new leaders help you get more money, get political will, and create an atmosphere of change? So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Andre Bailey. I am the these are our special guests. Don Gilman, CEO of Changing Homelessness, which is the CoC of Northeast Florida. You also run the SSVF grant for Southern Georgia?
For Southeast Georgia and parts of Northeast Florida. So
Okay.
17 counties in between the two states.
17 counties, so big CoC. And then Tim McKinney, he is the CEO of United Global Outreach, and he's actually the vice chair, a volunteer board member for the Central Florida Continuum of Care, which is what area?
Orange, Osceola, and Seminole County, here
So-
in Central Florida.
Yep, so about 2 million-ish people.
Maybe 2.5.
2.5 million people. So he's got 3 counties, 37 cities, and Don has like 17 counties. A lot of your area is rural. Jacksonville's a big city, but you also have to manage some very rural areas.
Right. And just for clarification, on our continuum of care, we're also a 3-county continuum of care,
Gotcha.
Duval, Clay, and Nassau County. But you're right, Duval County is very much the largest urban area in that continuum. The rest of the counties are much more urban to rural.
Gotcha.
Or
Gotcha.
suburban to rural. sorry.
Gotcha. So again, these are our guests, and here's what we're going to be talking about today. How do you bring together your community? You're the continuum of care. Some of you are going to be in big communities, some of you are in very small rural areas, but how do you break through that glass ceiling as the continuum of care and its leadership to get more leaders involved to solve homelessness? How can you do advocacy that complements that? I've seen Jacksonville and Central Florida do that very, very well. It sometimes can be a lot of work, but we've got to get our message out. And then how do you use, collective impact or a leadership recruiting of leaders in order to get more momentum? So we're going to talk about those over the next hour. And if you have questions, my team will get on me if I don't tell you this. If you have questions, you can ask them right now in the Go to Webinar control panel, and we can actually answer some of those questions during the webinar. So go into your control panel, or you can email us or text us questions when I say go to the Go to Meeting webinar. So how does a CoC really solve homelessness? Maybe I'll start with, and this isn't necessarily in the script, but Dawn, it's interesting because someone who runs a continuum of care or a board member that has governance over a continuum of care, you have to kind of make a decision. You can just manage the money you have, the resources you have, and help as many people as possible. I mean, and that's a good thing at times, but it probably starts with the decision that your role is to expand and help end homelessness, right? Is that part of the challenge?
That is absolutely part of the challenge. When I first got this position, we were a pretty small agency, not a whole lot of staff. Looking back on it, I think the key thing that I did was say yes. Some of the things that we said yes to at the time seemed very small, but over the past 10 years have grown into some of the most powerful movements and collaborations we have done. For example, back in 2010, there was a movement to house 100,000 of the most vulnerable chronic homeless people. It was difficult for us to create enough capacity just to do a registry week.
Yeah.
Since doing that, that is where a lot of our momentum has come from, just really realizing we did not know everybody who was on the streets. We had no idea how long some people had been out there. And that started a conversation within the providers on how do we shift to be able to address those who were most in need of what we had to offer.
But you had to decide as the leader of the continuum of care
To say yes.
to say yes to the 100,000 Homes campaign or whatever that initiative was. You could have just maintained the status quo, but that would have meant a lot of people dying on your streets. So Tim, as one of the volunteer leaders in Central Florida, and you've done this type of work, anti-poverty programs, work with housing, and work on homelessness for a lot of years, it kind of does start with a community and a continuum of care making a choice to try to go further, doesn't it?
Well, I think for us, we had made a choice to end homelessness. We had a program with that same name, and we were failing at it. And so really, when you came on the scene and we really decided to come in a direction and actually recognize that we needed to actually find out what would end homelessness, what was the solution to homelessness, and then refocus ourselves. And in fact, you might recall as a community advocate, you and I didn't hit it off right off the bat because you wanted
Hard to believe, but Tim didn't actually like me a
I
whole
mean,
lot when he met.
and
It's
it's-
shocking, my staff is
And
all
as
laughing.
charming as I am, it's hard to believe anybody wouldn't like me. But when you recommended we rethink the issue, I came out pretty strongly that haven't we thought enough about it, and the solution to homelessness seemed like it was housing.
Yeah.
But as a community, we hadn't made that decision.
It's true. Tim makes a really good point that although the advocates, we had talked exhaustively and to the point where we didn't even want to see each other anymore, there was a whole group of people, our top elected officials, our CEOs, our banks, our business community, and our faith community, not just people running shelters,
Mhm.
but the political leaders who have strong influence, that we had never figured out how to engage them right. And so, but it starts with the CoC, whether it's a board member or whether it's the staff, just deciding that where you're at right now isn't going to work. And again, let me go through quickly, and then we're going to hear some specifics from Tim and from Dawn on what I think the three big challenges all CoCs have. And again, if you have questions, go ahead and ask them in the chat box, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. So number one, CoC's big problems. These are not going to be shocking. Number one, not enough money. So in the research I've done, looking at communities, I've probably studied over 100 communities now over the past decade. It seems like HUD, whether they meant to or not, gives communities about 30% of the money they need in the NOFA CoC process to solve homelessness. Right? They don't give you nothing, but would you say that if you use your resources really well, 30-40% is about the max you're going to be able to get? Do you kind of see where that, again, in
Yeah.
some communities smaller, some larger, you don't get enough money through the NOFA process on its own to solve homelessness?
Correct. And there is no community that has reached functional or effective zero that has done it just with that HUD money.
Yeah, and I'll put a little asterisk here. Veterans, there's a lot of money, but even on the veterans issue, it takes some fungible money and extra money. And so CoCs don't have enough money. How do you solve that, though? That's a big question. The second is political will. I think this is sometimes as important as money. Money is hugely important. But do you have the elected officials? Do you have the housing authorities? Do you have an environment where your community is saying, we don't support housing first. We don't support. Tim, you can remember, 6 years ago in Central Florida, now you run one of the most successful continuums of care around as the vice chair. But there was a time, and that continuum is scoring really high on housing first and the success rates of permanent supportive housing. But there was a time when that continuum, there was no housing first strategy, and there was no one telling them they had to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we would all say our continuum was a failure based on outcomes. And I think the first step we had to come to is admitting we had a problem.
Yep, but I'll tell you, it wasn't just money. We actually, funny enough, in Central Florida, I believe Central Florida has gotten away a little bit with making great progress on the cheap because we were spending so much money the wrong way. When we figured out the right way to go through political will, we were able to reallocate a bunch of money, and all of a sudden we had mayors. One of the big moments in Central Florida was our mayor standing up and saying, we're going to do housing first and house the most chronic, the first 300. And when he said it, money then got moved. So the next thing I will tell you, and the last, is managing change is hard. What are your big problems? Even if you have money, even if you have some political will, how do you get your shelters to begin to be more open to giving people a humane experience that's housing first in nature? How do you bring all the diverse players together? Change is hard, and change can even transcend money. So money, political will, and change. These are the three areas we think you're struggling, I think, and I'd love, again, if you would tell me these are not your problems, and we've got a $100 gift certificate to Red Lobster. I'm kidding, but I would just say if there's any CoC out there that doesn't have these three problems, that would be shocking to me. So quickly, my staff says we're going to do a poll on this. So there's a poll. Submit your questions to the poll. Madison, how do they find the poll? Where is it at?
I will be launching it. It'll appear on their screen
All
very
right,
shortly.
the poll's going to appear on your screen. We want to know from you which one of these three do you have. But next slide. So here's the solution, and this is the big idea of the webinar today. We believe that CoCs need to consider doing collective impact, and again, don't get tied up in that name. I know a lot of you have studied collective impact. I'm using that term because you know what it means, but I'm not talking about necessarily the rigid Stanford University version. I'm meaning it in more of the collaboration with a real specific end goal purpose. So collective impact to attract new leaders and to transform how your community works on homelessness. That's my solution to those previous three problems. Again, collective impact, this is the old school Stanford version of it. I just put this up here because we know what it means, but what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of the high level things that continuum of care can do to have collective impact help solve those three problems. So rule number one, and I'm going to get Tim and Dawn to give me their thoughts on how they do this and how they'd recommend other continuums. If you want to be successful and bring your community together to solve those three problems, I'd say rule number one is bring your top leaders together. So whether it's government, business, funders, criminal justice, faith-based organizations, healthcare, and of course the nonprofits. Sometimes, and Dawn, I know you can appreciate this, sometimes our continuums of care become a little bit isolated, they become insular, and they're not really a representation of the community in a way that gets us the resources and the will we need. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and I think there is, and I think most of the people that are on this webinar that are running continuums of care know that there is a big difference in who shows up for these conversations or meetings, and it depends on who calls the meeting. If it is your mayor or it is your governor that suddenly decides that this is their issue, suddenly it is much easier to get the decision maker level people from each of these different sectors. I think sometimes there is a little bit of exhaustion within the sector, so we're not as open to coming back and having that fresh conversation again. So a lot of this, it's not just bringing those leaders together, it's also recognizing when we do get those new faces in the room, we are probably going to retread ground that's really familiar to us.
And really annoying.
It can be. It can, and we've all been in that meeting where we know that we're saying the same thing for the 20th time, and 15 out of the 45 people in the room have heard us all 20 times. But the rest of that group really needs to understand why we're advocating for what we're advocating for. Why do we say we need to do a housing first model? Why is it important to understand who the most vulnerable people on our streets are? And yes, we actually do work together, and we have something called coordinated entry. And absolutely, we do have the data to show what we're doing.
Yep, and I'm going to get Tim's opinion on this, but what Dawn, one of the things Dawn is really saying here is, again, we mean this to be a healthy challenge for the CoC, especially those that staff or are CEOs of a CoC. It's so easy just to focus on the friendlies, those that run nonprofits, those that are part of the current system. But rule number one is, if you don't figure out how to engage your top leaders in these sectors, you're never going to solve those problems. Tim, as someone who has been involved in this work, how do you see the need for these leaders in your community?
It's essential. Before I joined the CoC, and just as a community advocate working on issues of poverty, full transparency, we had only providers, a half a dozen or a dozen, trading checks around every year. And so there was no leverage, there was no transparency, there was no broad sector movement. So that was really one of our biggest challenges, is gaining control of the continuum of care for the broader community, so that we could then go back in and tweak and change the way that we were doing business. Because again, we were just exchanging checks back and forth on the CoC board that really was very dysfunctional. And so engaging all of these broad sectors, including, I would say, not just nonprofits that are service providers, but in my case, we don't receive any funding from HUD or from the CoC, so we're able to advocate for the cause in a much stronger way, which has helped our providers come around to the right mission.
Yeah, and again, CoC leaders, this takes a decision. I feel like I know a lot of you out there. We have almost 200 CoCs. Actually, 1 out of 4 CoCs in America signed up for the webinar. So you have hundreds of leaders on this right now. But again, I think I want to encourage you by telling you, you're the salt of the earth. You're doing such hard, good work, but there's kind of a decision you have to make where you realize that if you don't, like Dawn, I'll say what Dawn said a minute ago a different way. Dealing with these people is a pain in the ass, 100% pain in the ass. Like having to bring a mayor in who's going to have to be educated again, and these 10 CEOs who are going to be very conservative and not understand housing first, and you're going to have to baptize them into understanding it. It's all this work. That's true, but you're never going to get the resources and the support you need unless you do that. So,
and most importantly, you're not going to solve the problem.
And you're not going to help the people on your street. So, rule number one, you're going to have to consider breaking open the group that you're probably working with right now and creating a new leadership team. We're going to tell you a way to do that in a second. Number two, use advocacy. I think advocacy, in the way we typically use it, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this today. We might do another webinar just on advocacy. But advocacy that's done right on homelessness is done not to necessarily change the opinion of the common person out there, who their opinion does matter. But I'm talking about advocacy to get your mayors, your county commissioners, and the people that help make decisions, getting them more involved. We did a pretty successful campaign here called Rethink Homelessness. Some of you probably saw it. We'll actually send a link out to some of the advocacy pieces we used. But, and Tim, I'll come back to you. You saw the importance of whether it was talking to the media or the newspapers or, social media in showing elected officials, business leaders, that the community wanted solutions here.
Yeah, and actually this is where we kind of tangled at the very beginning, because I thought as a community leader that works in this space that we were just going to do another study or another analysis that would end up dusty on a shelf somewhere. And this really was transformational to our work.
Yep. And just to move it along, we'll go to the next slide. The third rule, and this is one that seems a little complex, but many of you have already done this at times in work with the 100,000 Homes campaign, Built for Zero. You've seen which those organizations, I think, if I give them, the most credit I give them is organizing a community in a way that creates a movement
Mhm.
or a moment in time where people are working together on a goal. This chart don't necessarily focus on the order as much as focus on the idea that you're going to pull leaders together and then engage in a process where you solve big goals. Dawn, you have done a lot of work on the veterans issue, and a lot of the momentum that you've seen and you're seeing now is around, and the rallying of leaders is around the big goal and the ending point.
Absolutely. Once you set a stake in the ground and you say, we will achieve this and put a date to it, especially if your political leaders buy into that, they become incredibly interested in weekly and monthly updates towards that goal. That's where, again, part of that education process really comes back into play. We're dealing with a very dynamic and fluid situation. So how do we show progress to that goal, even when things are going up and down in a weekly or monthly way?
And again, I know this sounds, to some of you, pie in the sky, because it's like, oh, Andre, simple, right? Do a community movement, recruit the most powerful people and have them show up and work on homelessness, and then do advocacy that just captivates everyone. Why didn't you tell me it was this simple, Andre? Trust me, I know that can be the first impression, but I think both Dawn and Tim and I and some of you, you've seen these ceilings, the glass ceilings break through these methods. That's why we want to reiterate and show you how to do it. So I'm going to come, again, more money, more political support and change. I'm going to come back to Tim for a second and ask Tim to give me some specifics about Orlando. So Tim, I put this, you remember this article from 2013. In 2013, the AHAR came out in Orlando, Central Florida, in fairness, not just the city of Orlando, but it's 2.5 million people, 3 counties. That Central Florida ranked #1 for mid-sized cities on chronic homelessness, and ranked in the top 4 categories on everything that HUD measured. And from there, this was an article from just, I think, recently. Homelessness down now 4 years in a row in Central Florida. These numbers vacillate a little bit, but through 4 years of looking at our numbers, veterans homelessness down about 95%, and overall homelessness probably down about 50%. And we can show you thousands of people, most importantly, living in apartments now who got rapid rehousing, got supportive housing, that were not getting that before.
I mean, just to put it in context, our point-in-time count has reduced 11% over 5 years, at the same time as we just got the dubious distinction of being the least most affordable place to live in the United States.
Yeah, so listen, I know you've got affordable housing challenges, so does Central Florida, so does Jacksonville. I know a lot of your folks are struggling from a poverty standpoint. We've seen progress here, and if we've seen it, anyone can do it. Tim, talk a little bit about how Orlando, in your opinion, used those 3 aspects: advocacy, bringing cross-sector leaders together, and having kind of a movement. How did you see it happen here?
Well, I mean, for me, one of the most attractive things about, we already had a plan. The community was already doing something, and we were failing.
Well, so we had, in clarity, we were a community that had a 10 to end.
Yeah.
We had like 9 10 to end plans, and every time we did them, they never worked.
And then we were named the worst area.
So the end of our 10 to end plan, after 5 years, we actually, homelessness doubled. It didn't go down. So
failure. So what attracted me to want to become involved in the CoC and provide community leadership and then support Andre and our elected officials in their work was we actually had a solution to the problem. We actually knew what solved homelessness, which was housing first, and then we worked to coordinate. And to your point, political influence, leadership in general is more valuable than money, because it leverages all the resources that we need to solve the problem.
So this is a random photo, but who are the people just in this photo right here?
Yeah, I mean, you've got pastors of mega churches in this photo, you've got our mayors, you've got formerly homeless in this photo, the heads of the largest nonprofits, Heart of Florida, United Way, and then again, just some of our most powerful community leaders, athletes.
The Orlando Magic basketball team, this is them supporting the homeless initiative and the continuum of care.
Yeah, again, I think people are just burned out on treating the symptoms of the issue and not solving it. I mean, in fact, here's our former HUD secretary,
Yeah,
Mel
I forgot about
Martinez.
that. This is Mel Martinez, who lives in this community advocating for homelessness. And so, Tim, you saw, again, those three elements, bringing leaders together and creating a movement and doing advocacy. You saw them as a very important part of that reduction in homelessness.
Essential, and then to your earlier point, we've taken our HUD funding and we've made it more the cornerstone of the building, and it's incredibly strategic in leveraging the greater resources that have now come to the table.
So as a continuum of care, one of the folks out there, and by the way, Quaz, if there's questions, you can go ahead and start supplying them to me. If you have questions, you can go into your chat box and ask questions right now. So one of the things that I think is also important, let me pull this up, because I think I'd be remiss to not share this. But although we didn't want to just do more data, data was an important part and continues to play an important part. We looked at, these are reports that Central Florida actually put together. One was looking at the best practice continuums of care in communities around America. One was on family homelessness. One was on chronic homelessness. One was on veterans homelessness. So we examined and used data to understand homelessness across the board. This might be a good time, Tim, because we had talked about this before the webinar started, and Dawn was giving her thoughts as well. One of the things that was important to the success, both in Orlando and in Jacksonville, was creating and having the continuum of care create a conversation that made sense around homelessness. What I mean by that is, I think you guys out there watching this, your continuum of care leaders around America, you see that there's this struggle between people that sometimes want to work on chronic homelessness and those that are, street homelessness, the people that we see in our point in time counts, the people that HUD gives us funding for, and people that are very well-meaning, but they want to see broader things happen in a continuum of care that look more like, whether we admit it or not, anti-poverty programs. Dawn, do you think it's important for a continuum of care in this process of engaging the community to help give clarification, to give it focus?
That is key, and it needs to be reframed at almost every meeting. When we talk about a homeless continuum of care, it is designed and funded for people who are literally homeless, or the HUD definition of homeless, meaning you are in a shelter, transitional housing, or a place not meant for human habitation. Oftentimes I will actually calculate out the difference between how many people are literally homeless on any given night in our community or over a year versus how many people experience poverty within the same community. So just as an idea of what that size differential, our point in time count has never gone over 2,000 people. So maybe 15 to 30,000 people annually, depending on how you count the numbers in as the shelter flow through, experience homelessness at some point during the year. We have 150,000 households just in Duval County that are at or below the poverty level.
Gotcha.
So the magnitude of funding needed to address poverty is exponentially larger than what you need to address a very discrete problem of homelessness. And I think all of us, and I'm talking to all the CoC leaders who get into this push and pull, none of us got into this business to say no, but we have to be able to say no so we can say yes when it is a matter of life and death. And that is why we triage and why we have coordinated intake and why we do the vulnerability assessments that we do.
Tim, let me give you a question that'll put it on the tee for you. Sure. Melissa Baker from Housing Solutions Center was asking, can you please touch base on the utilization of by name lists of, especially chronically homeless, to end homelessness? I think you were a big part of helping the community understand that although there's something very important from a practical standpoint of knowing, for example, who's chronically homeless, who's got a disability, who needs a voucher and supportive housing, it's also important for your top leaders to understand what that means because we can't solve poverty inside of our homeless continuums of care, and there can be a nervousness about admitting that. But in Orlando, we had to admit it.
Well, no successful business leader wants to be a part of dealing with an unsolvable problem, and no elected leader wants to be a part of something that's not going to succeed. So again, everybody has to have the same talking points, and so what we did very successfully here is everybody knew exactly what the definition of homelessness was. It was literally homeless, and everybody knew exactly what the definition of chronic homeless was. Those that are permanently disabled, physically disabled, or have some type of a mental illness and experience long-term homelessness. So again, everybody was on the same page, and therefore suddenly our top level leaders were able to engage and say, hey, we can be involved in this, and we can actually provide resources to solve this problem because it's clearly defined and it is solvable because we know exactly what it is.
I want to say this to some of you CoC leaders out there. Whether it's using data by itself or creating a by name list and showing the costs of chronic homelessness, I've heard from a lot of you CoC leaders that, privately, Andre, it's just easier to get the community behind families and children. And so, we lead with that, and we just help the chronic homeless on the side here. That is true, that it's easier to just, put out photos and we're helping kids. But if you don't make a case, Orlando, Jacksonville, I think both these communities have done a good job where they made the case for why we needed supportive housing. And if you don't make that case and you don't differentiate on why people are homeless, you're going to put yourself in a no-win situation.
Listen, this is why it's important. It's easier to address family homelessness. My day job, I deal with poverty, but in the meantime, real people are dying every day on our streets if we can't narrow the message down. And so I think putting faces, as we were able to do, to this issue that had died, that died and suffered unnecessarily, really drove our leadership to understand that even though this may be easier and make us feel better about ourselves, this is more important because real people's lives depended on our success.
Orlando, and I'm going to move, we're going to move on from this in a second, but Orlando, one of the most successful things Orlando did was force a conversation on chronic homelessness, where originally there was just a community bias against anyone who was on the streets a long time. Dawn, they were dirty, they were scary, they were panhandling. So we did this study, and Dawn, I think you remember this, where we studied the costs of long-term homelessness for the chronically homeless. We'll actually send this study out as part of the follow-up to the webinar. But we found that the chronically homeless, not a shock to you guys, were people who cost a lot of money. They were $36,000 a year when we studied chronic homelessness, and it was half of that or less than half of that to house them. You guys know that, but it was getting the business leaders and the faith leaders and the other elected officials to know that. So we made the case. It's easier to just sell kids and families, but be careful if you shy away from proving why your role, one of your roles is so important, is helping those that are chronically homeless.
But what you did right after you made that case was then you had cardboard stories right behind it. So you actually told people's stories, and I think it shocked everyone, including me who works in this space, that I used to be a professional football player. I have cancer. All of those stories behind the chronics, I think just really helped our community move forward.
And I'm going to flip back to the by name list, because the whole Rethink Homelessness was a very successful campaign, and it did draw in a lot of people for the continuums of care and kind of the inside baseball part of that by name list. You can't get to what your inflow and outflow is unless you really religiously adhere to that by name list. That means adding people as they become chronically homeless. It means following them and doing your very best to try to trace where do people go when they disappear. The VA, if you can get VA resources to help you on your veteran by name list through their homes nationwide database, they can be super helpful in getting a percentage of how many people exit off your by name list, yet they're still in your community somewhere.
Yeah,
So-
and Don, I would say we could do a whole webinar on just by name list, because one of the worst things you can do is, another way of looking at a by name list is, you need to know who's gonna get that voucher.
Right.
Those vouchers are so finite. That's why, if you house people who might be easier to house because your by name list or your system isn't where it should be, you don't get a do-over if you run out of resources from housing the wrong people.
Correct. So on our by name list for chronically homeless, we usually have somewhere around 200 people who have met the definition of chronic homelessness and need a permanent voucher. In a good month, we have 10 to 12 openings. So it is critical that the people that move into that housing are the people that need it the most.
Again, for us, 6 years ago, we had no coordinated entry system to
Literally didn't
speak of,
exist.
and we didn't have a single entry point. And then, even if we had providers using HMIS, they were putting data on the wrong lines, so we couldn't even pull reports that told us who our chronically homeless were. So much work has been done by Homeless Services Network to actually get everybody putting the information in the right spot, so we can track, to your point, where people are.
But let me say this though, to Continuum of Cares out there who, they hear Tim talk about, Dawn talk about the success. Orlando specifically, over a short period of time, Jacksonville over more of a 10-year period of time, but the success would not have happened in these communities without engaging top leaders, without creating a collective strategy on homelessness, getting leaders to know that we need to do things like housing first, and we need resources for permanent supportive housing, we need veterans to get the help they need. It's not enough if just the providers know that. It's not enough if someone that's 3 levels down, working their tail off in government knows it. We had to get top leaders involved in that strategy. And then the use of media, advocacy to drive that point home. That was done, and those were kind of some keys to how Orlando, we've heard this from our foundation, Orlando reallocated, moved about $58 million total in roughly 3 years. That would not have happened. That ceiling would not have been broken through without these 3 areas.
And without our top leaders and our media being used effectively, we wouldn't have gotten our providers to decide to reorganize their business.
I'm going to come to Dawn right now. Again, if you have questions, throw them in the chat box. Lloyd Schmeider, I hope I said that name right, from Community Development Department of Durham. Would you say more about what the cross-sector leadership group does? What are the agendas of the meetings? So I would tell you, Lloyd, that, and I'll get to this a little bit later, I encourage Continuum of Cares to do something a little different. You're supposed to put some business leaders on your Continuum of Care, and you should do that. I encourage your Continuum of Care to create a side business leader committee, and have a business leader committee that might be 6, 8, 10, 12 people. They're not necessarily board members, they're not voting members, but create a group of business leaders. You might do this in partnership with the United Way, you might do it in a broader sense, but somehow the Continuum of Care needs to get the business community coordinated together and use that setting to help educate them and then get them focused on some bigger goals. One example that we've seen work really well, and we did this in Orlando, is, isn't that a great picture of Dawn? So, one of the things that we saw work in Orlando, and I think Dawn has seen work in Jacksonville, is get leaders together and then get them focused on the lowest hanging fruit so they can see success, which is veterans, homelessness, and chronic homelessness. We're going to send you out something we call our 12 dynamics. We've studied homeless solutions around America. We believe there are 12 dynamics to solutions. Guys, veterans, homelessness, and chronic homelessness, those people aren't more important, but if you get business leaders involved and you can show them progress can be made, there's amazing things that can come from that. So Lloyd, get them educated and get them focused on helping raise money, raise awareness, change a policy, pressure the housing authority to put vouchers in, et cetera, et cetera. So Dawn, talk a little bit about how your community and how you've rallied your homelessness down, and specifically maybe what you're doing on veterans right now in
Okay.
Jacksonville.
So One of the big differences that we've had in the past, I'd say 3 to 4 years, is we've had more engagement from our mayor's office, and that has directly come through the success that we're having with veterans. So Jacksonville, and specifically the current mayor, has a goal that Jacksonville will be the most veteran-friendly city in the United States. So part of that then is a focus on why do we still have homeless veterans. So in our community, since in the last 10 years, we've dropped veteran homelessness by about 80%. So it used to run about equal to the population. In our 3 counties, there's about 25% veterans amongst the community in general. And that used to be the same in our homeless community. We now have about 7% of our homeless population is a veteran, are veterans. Like any other subpopulation, the real heavy lift is getting different programs to work together. In most of our communities, we are program rich and we are system poor. When we talk about that lack of funding, a lot of times it's easier to identify the lack of funding on the programmatic side, but when we look at how much money we as different communities spend on coordinating this really diverse system, we spend a very, very small percentage on a job that really is just people intense. I know I'm preaching to the choir for those of you who are out there. Probably anybody who is leading a continuum of care, 80% of your job feels, some days 120% of your job is just going from meeting to meeting to meeting, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be in that room.
The coordination of all the players involved.
Exactly, and to know what is actually going on in your hospital that is delivering services to the indigent population versus what is happening at the school board and how many students are they seeing that are showing up as unaccompanied minors. So there's a lot of work that way.
Don, you did something, and I want to pivot to Tim. You did Orlando and Jacksonville did something similar, not exactly the same, but similar. Where on veterans homelessness, you took a week, a month, different seasons of time to focus your community as a whole, not just the service providers that normally work on veterans homelessness, but you got business leaders, you got faith leaders out on the streets looking at who's homeless. Tim, you were a part of the veteran surge in Orlando, Central Florida. So back to the question this gentleman Lloyd posed about, well, what do you do with these business leaders? Get them out on the streets and show them what chronic homelessness and all of these folks, show them what a by name list is. Show them how you're getting people off the streets using HUD Bash and using SSVF. And so I think Dawn and Tim have done a great job at, once you bring these business leaders together, baptize them into this work.
Well, that's what happened for me personally. I mean, I'm not staff, so we took trips together. We studied this issue together. We got on the streets together. We did the point in time count together. We met these folks personally, and it just literally transformed our leadership.
Yeah. So Lloyd, back to your question and to other CoC leaders, I can't stress to you enough what happens when you get your top leaders really understanding homelessness at a deep level. I had the chance 3 years ago to do outreach. We took our mayor, we took some of our CEOs and did outreach with them. I was at our lake where a lot of the homeless people are during a surge, a veteran surge. And Dawn, it was amazing. The mayor's there. He's got his clipboard. He's got his intake form. You know, he's got his what's the survey again?
VSPDAT.
The VSPDAT. He's got Ian Spadat out there. He's learning what this is. And we in the first 10 minutes, we meet a 21-year-old young veteran who had been sleeping at Lake Eola 6 months after he had gotten out of the military, and he was mentally ill. And I saw Mayor Dyer right in front of my eyes become converted. This is housing first. Oh, this is why you go out and create that by name list. So you've seen a lot of success in Jacksonville, again, as you are doing your job running the CoC, but you're also becoming the engager of the community on the bigger issue. I'm going to let you get into this, but Taylor Donovan had this question. Anchorage Coalition.
Yeah.
So that's quite a challenge you have there. We have similar issues to it being easier to serving youth and families, but it's not just with the public, it's also with our service providers.
Yes.
Do you have any tips on how to help providers get more onboarding with serving the chronically homeless population with higher service needs? So I would say this, I think, and I want Dawn to address how she had to kind of challenge, because when Ted Yoho, which is one of our top elected leaders, was pushing back on Housing First, in my opinion, he was really becoming the mouthpiece for some people that had that families need help, not chronic.
Mhm.
So in Anchorage, I would tell you, in my opinion, I've done this work a very long time, service providers, some of them will gravitate towards families and children because that's where their fundraising happens as well. I'm not saying that they're bad people, that they have malicious intent, but guys, it's hard to make a case for until you do it. It's hard to tell this guy who you had to that Housing First sometimes has to start with our most vulnerable and our most visible.
And I would say, if you have not already done it, whoever your chief of police or sheriff, depending on how your local law enforcement is set up, they are often an unexpected ally in chronic homelessness and Housing First, especially if your chief law enforcement officer has lived and worked their way up the ranks, because they have arrested your chronically homeless people over and over and over. We started making movement with a previous sheriff who came up through the corrections department, where his tagline was, "Jail is not therapeutic." And he knew that he was the largest provider of mental health care services within our county, as probably is your sheriff and every other sheriff in every other urban county in this country. They are someone that can start small pilot programs. There's a lot of different examples. We have one in ours called CHOPS that happens at first appearance, where someone who gets a literal choice between their jail time or moving into an apartment. Like, there is an apartment available ready for them to move into straight off the streets, or actually within less than 5 days. That has demonstrated that even the people that can't be fixed or are service resistant or any of the other euphemisms that we all hear, even they can be successful most of the time.
Yeah, Tim, and this is for those who wonder about the slide. We had a congressman, House Representative.
Ted Yoho is a congressman from Northeast Florida.
He was at the rally yesterday, and Ted had got some providers that said to him, sent a letter to HUD.
Yes,
that
no more Housing
No
First.
more Housing First. The Housing First is bad. And by the way, Mr. Representative Yoho probably didn't have a lot of information other than what he was given. I'll piggyback on this question right here. Lonnie Adeline, Ramsey County Health and Wellness Administration. How do you separate poverty from homelessness? Most people are homeless because of poverty due to lack of affordable housing and landlords that are and I'll let Tim comment on this question and this quandary, because I got to tell you, I think it's one of the most important things a CoC and its leadership have to figure out right now. We have more and more people presenting themselves to shelters who are families with children who have economic issues than we've ever seen before.
Mm-hmm.
In the best economy we've ever had, we've got more and more people who have economic challenges, which is putting them in a position where they're precariously housed. As a CoC leader, though, you have to be able to create distinctions between people who have economic challenges and people who are chronically homeless, who their problems go beyond economics, in that they're not going to be able to be self-sufficient because of a disability. Guys, we have to get away from some of the idealism in this conversation, because if we don't, we're not able to allocate resources and make distinctions.
Yeah.
That's not to say all these people aren't important, but if someone cannot be self-sufficient because of a mental illness and a disability, it's unfair to put them in the same category as someone who does need help but needs maybe rapid rehousing, or maybe a new jobs program, et cetera. Is it important to make that distinction, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, again, you have to have the right definition and the right problem that needs to be solved. And then to the earlier question related to getting providers on the page and how to get them to change their ways, we engage business leaders. Well, guess who makes up the boards of every nonprofit in your area? Business leaders. So if you can get your business leaders to buy into this permanent supportive housing model, then they go back to their boards and their nonprofits and they question, why aren't we participating in that? And then they really drive down their influence to get executives of those nonprofits to get with the program. And as you know, we dealt with this together on some issues. We had some very powerful nonprofit leaders that ran shelters and other things that didn't want to get with the program. And eventually their board said, you got to go, because those business leaders had decided this was the right thing to do. And to this guy's question, again, I deal with poverty issues every day. I want to solve everybody's problems, but the CoC's mandate is to address homelessness. And so in this space, we have to keep the conversation very tight around street homelessness, the literally homeless.
Yep, and again, Don, we don't want to sound heartless, but we gotta, as CoC leaders, again, this is your mandate and challenge. You care for everyone that presents themselves to your shelter system or lives in a hotel or is couch surfing. But if you're going to be effective, your definitions of who's homeless by a literal or street definition, and then the programs and resources, critical.
So, and as a leader, part of the challenge, a real challenge, is having people understand that everyone can't get everything, right? Those people that have had a economic disruption in their lives, I use the term lightest touch. That is diversion. There's a couple communities across the country that do extraordinary work in diverting, especially families, out of the homeless system entirely. That is helping that family. I think some of our providers have it in their head, if they don't give them everything they've got, somehow they're not helping that family.
And Don, there's also, this is worthy of a much bigger conversation, but I would tell you, there should be a lot of thought given to taking the model and the system for chronic homelessness and applying it exactly to family homelessness without nuance.
Because it does not fit. It's just like when we talk about a subpopulation of veterans.
Or youth.
Yes, both groups are absolutely literally homeless, but they're at really different stages in their lives, and they need different things to be successful.
Correct. So we'll send you a little information because I want to be cognizant of time. There's some communities, Salt Lake City, for example. We work with Barb Poppy, the former homeless czar for President Obama. She was talking a lot about the progressive engagement model and how you would look at educated, smart ways that your CoC works with those who are families who have economic issues. But again, you make that distinction on chronic homelessness. HUD asks you to make that distinction, and I think morality asks you to make it, and you'll be successful. So in Jacksonville, just for the sake of time, they keep bringing in new leaders to support best practices. They use the media. Dawn has never met a camera or a reporter that she doesn't like. And
neither has Andre, by the way.
That's true. That's very true. All my staff laughed at that. So, and I think Dawn has managed resources really well. I can't tell you the details, but she's working on another big resource bucket right now, and she's kind of recruiting some business leaders. She's got this new resource bucket that would be a lot of money for her community, and the first thing she did is reach out to her leaders to try to get those business leaders to put pressure on so-and-so and that guy to make it happen. So using resources well. I don't want to get into this, but one of the big points of all of this is that you've got all of this mess in a community that a continuum doesn't really have power over. And what we're really saying is if you can build leaders, new leaders, use advocacy, and get a movement going, kind of again like the 100,000 Homes campaign does successfully, although I would say the only slight nuance in the way that I push is not that the 100,000 Homes campaign, Community Solutions, does anything bad at all. They're one of the best groups in America. But I would say you make a mandate to pull the most powerful leaders into the collaborative. And I know Community Solutions asked you to do that, so they agree with that. But the idea is, here's where homelessness usually lies. How do you create these bigger factors that move things that aren't necessarily movable? 4 recommendations in the last 5 minutes. One last question and 4 recommendations based on what we've seen work around America. And we're going to send you a bunch of resources after the webinar. Thanks for joining us. But 4 recommendations for CoCs that you can do today. Number 1, build a business council. You can call it whatever you want. Call it an advisory team. Create it in partnership with your United Way or some other group. But build a group of business leaders who are going to be educated and help you set big goals and get big money. It will be a lot of work, but again, if you want to break that glass ceiling, you've got to get new people involved. Number 2, create a community campaign. And again, 100,000 homes, the technical assets they give you, you guys, many of you have done those campaigns. I think, Dawn, one of the most important things they also do is they just help your community have a banner, a flag to march behind. So whatever it is, whether it's Anchorage Ends Homelessness or Orange County United We End Homelessness, which is what Orange County, California is doing, whatever it is, bring your community together around advertising. Marketing does matter, even on homelessness. Number 3, build an impact fund. We didn't talk a lot about this, but I would just tell you this. The money that you can raise when you're focused on big goals, ending veterans homelessness, ending chronic homelessness, the money that you can raise is completely, in my opinion, different than when you're just maintaining a continuum of care. We saw our big hospital system, Advent Health, give $6 million without being asked, without being solicited. But that didn't come because to maintain homelessness, it came towards a big goal and came towards a purpose. So create a special designation, however you do that, where you're raising money for these big goals. And then again, number 4, advocacy. Try to make big things happen. As we kind of wrap up, we've got more questions. If we didn't answer your question, we will follow up with questions. Leslie Cummings, Mercy City County and Continuum of Care, in your opinion, is it a CoC's place to issue comment on current administration's proposed HUD regulations regarding mixed status families? So I would just say this. If it was me, and I'm the head of a continuum of care, I'm going to build business leaders around me, and I'm going to have them speak for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's been, I think, essential to our success as we've driven Republicans and Democrats together, again, around a very clear mission, and the staff is not put in the awkward position of having to take that type of a stand.
Tim is a volunteer. He's a board member. So if there's a tough conversation that needs to be had, the staff might ask Tim to have the tough conversation.
And our other very powerful elected officials and very powerful business leaders who have the ear of the policymakers.
And I'm going to let Dawn get into this for just a second, then we're going to wrap up. But my advice is, your job as a staff member of the CoC is to bring collaboration and say yes when it comes to elected officials and policymakers, and then have other people, if you can, say no and have the tough conversations.
So, and it's not just this particular issue with this administration. The other thing that we're always asked to do is to reallocate money or put it to the highest and best use within our community. When it is not always you being the bad guy, but there is a group of leaders that are saying, we made this decision because, or in the case that Leslie just asked, we are advocating for a different position and this is why, it is much more powerful to a larger group.
As we wrap up, let me just say this. You can download this presentation underneath the presentation tab in the GoToMeeting webinar. There's also other handouts we have there, and we're going to send you some other things over the next few days. From a resource standpoint, as we wrap up, I just want to say this. In my opinion, whether it was 8 years of George W. Bush whether it was 8 years of Barack Obama and whatever the future holds, whoever's in the White House, listen, the money for you to solve this issue is never going to come down from the federal government in totality. We need good policies at HUD. We need good money inside of the continuum of care coming down through the NOFA process. But you've got to get your local elected officials and your local business community and your local housing authority and your local VA on board to solve this issue. So much more to talk about, but again, a huge thank you to Dawn and Tim for being our guests. Yay! Wow, they didn't even clap. If you have questions, I'll supply their emails after this as well for them. Here's our email. Here's a phone number you can text questions to. Thank you for all you're doing, Continuum of Care leaders around America. Push to have a business council, bring new leaders to the table, create a movement. Let's break through that ceiling in 2019 and beyond to help more people in need. Thank you for joining. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.